Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Doug Smith with Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative, and today we're hosting Ms. Kim Howard from the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and she's going to provide us with a session on structured teaching using structured workstations. Ms. Kim, I'll let you take it away and everyone enjoy, and if you have questions or anything, please feel free to ask. And I'll sign in the chat, and I'll be dropping some other links in the chat as we go along. So thank you all and have a great evening.
So I will say, feel free to turn your camera on or off. I'm going to leave mine on just for a few minutes. So I am Kim Howard, and I partner with Doug sometimes at KVEC and some of the other folks there, and sometimes we put out trainings. So they asked me to come in and talk a little bit about structured teaching. So hopefully you see something that says structured workstations. I will tell you a little bit about my background. I worked in classrooms. I was a classroom teacher, both moderate and severe disabilities and learning and behavior disorder. So when I talk about structured workstations in the classroom, I use them and I still use them. I still help other teachers put those into place in their classrooms. So when I first heard about structured workstations, and it comes from a practice called structured teaching, I love structured workstations. If I could get a t-shirt that said that, I would completely wear it. When I first heard about structured workstations, I thought, well, that sounds like a whole bunch of hooey, right? That sounds like stuff that, you know, real smart people, someone thought that up, and I didn't see how that would be practical in my classroom. And at that time, my classroom was a zoo, pretty much a zoo. I worked in a self-contained moderate and severe disabilities unit, and I had 12 kids and ages from preschool through 6th grade, and all different ability levels, all different diagnosis, right? I'm here for Kentucky Autism Training Center, and they work extremely well for students who are autistic. But the nice thing about structured workstations is that they work with a lot of different kids. So when I first heard about them, I thought, well, that sounds real nice, you know, and I'll go to this training, but I don't see how that will work for me. And when I went to the training and I saw what it was, and I came back and put some of those things into place for my classroom, it took me from one day my principal came down the hallway and is like, Miss Howard, do you think that you can keep your students' heads inside of the windows? Some of the parents are concerned, and I'm like, listen, buddy, I'm trying real hard here. Everybody went home alive at the end of the day. It's awesome. You know, I'm really trying to keep my kids' head. So it took me from, you know, my kids are hanging out of the windows of my classroom, and just they're everywhere. I didn't have good instructional control. A lot of my students had a 3-second attention span. So if I was going to teach them something, I had about 2 seconds to get that in. And so my kids were difficult, to say the least. And so this gave me a vehicle, a tool that I could use to teach them how to learn, because that's what I saw that this was the most beneficial for my students that came into me and they did not know how to learn. And I had never experienced that before. I always just assumed, you know, kids come to school, they're going to know how to learn, but we know, and I'm assuming that you're here because you're working with kids who are in special education, that sometimes our kids come and they don't know how to learn. And our job, we have to step back from teaching them the material to teaching them how to learn. So that's what I loved about structured workstations. And I like them, especially because many kids with autism, visual learning is a strength, right? And many of our kids with a variety of disabilities, visual learning is a strength. And structured work systems and structured workstations kind of capitalizes on that visual learning skill that they have that's just innate for them sometimes. So that's what I like about it. So what is a structured work system? It comes from out of North Carolina through the Chapel Hill, North Carolina, through an organization called TEACCH, TEACCH. So if you've never heard of that before, look them up. So it is purposeful organization of learning materials to assist learners with autism and a variety of other disabilities in answering the following questions. What am I supposed to do? Question number 1, our kids come in, they don't know what to do. And so typically material is placed in baskets, boxes, bins, It could be placed in a folder system, and it just depends on your student. It answers, how much am I supposed to do? Well, how many baskets are there? Or you might also have a mini schedule. And I'm going to show you a picture of some workstations in a minute if you haven't seen them before. So how do I know when I'm finished? How do I make this work go away? That's a big question for a lot of our kids. Well, all of the baskets are gone. Or if you're using a mini schedule, then your icons are all moved past the left. What do I do next? At the end of your workstation, the last item should send that child back to the schedule or to a choice board, however your room works. And when I first started utilizing this in my classroom, none of my students were on individual schedules. None of my students, I had a whole class schedule that we used. Teaching that and going back to learn how to use those individual schedules was really critical for some of my students. Okay, so who might need a workstation? Who can we use this with? Anyone. I have used this with students who are in full inclusion, so they are in the regular classroom all day long. I have used this with kids who are in a self-contained classroom, students who spend time in both. I have used this with my mother-in-law who has dementia, pretty significant Alzheimer's, and she is 79. And we have used parts of a workstation or parts of structured teaching with her. I have used this I had a student who was, I would say, incredibly functional. His full scale IQ was over 179. So think Albert Einstein. He was very, very smart, but he couldn't learn in a school setting. He did not know how to learn in a school setting. He could learn as long as it was things he wanted to learn, right? As long as he had the control of it, but being able to be in a classroom and be with other students was really hard for him. And he did not know, he couldn't cope very well in that setting until we taught him a structured workstation, and his went with him wherever he went. And when he was in the first grade in my classroom, I'll tell you about it. I'll tell you about what we put in his workstation in a little bit. These are useful at home. So if you have students and your school is still going on, and sometimes you're in school, sometimes we're having to go out for distance learning, or we're having to close the school because of COVID or other concerns, and you're still doing like non-traditional instruction days. This is something that if it's been taught to the student, then this could potentially go home with them. And if you have high school students who are transitioning, this can be used in a work setting. This is something that could go to work with them with a little bit of modifications and setup. So that's the thing that I really like about this is that I've not found very many people that this is not appropriate for if they're struggling with learning how to learn or being able to access learning. So a workstation, this is essentially a workstation. And it can look like 1,000 different things. This is a very formal, I would call independent learning. It doesn't have to look this formal, is the first thing that I will say. I have used a lot of different setups this is what I would call an independent workstation. So most of my students did not work independently. And it was a revolutionary moment when I taught them to work on their own. And so the way that this works is you have these bins and containers on the left side, and the student is going to obviously sit in the chair. And this one has a mini matching schedule. And the job is that the child is going to take a picture off that schedule and match it to the bin. And then they're going to pull that bin onto the table. And then they're going to do that activity. Now, here's the catch 22. The child has to be able to do that activity independently. It has to be something that they can do on their own. Now, for some of my students, this meant that the only skill that when we first started with this, the only skill that they had that they could do independently, I had a student who had visual impairments and a diagnosis with autism. So he was pretty much not totally blind, but I think he could see some shadows, but he had minimal vision. And he also had a diagnosis of autism. And so when we started with learning how to do structured work system, his bins and containers were a bucket, and in each bucket was a ball. So we put one bucket had a soccer ball, one bucket had a football, one bucket had a basketball, and he would We didn't do the mini matching schedule with him because he couldn't see the match and he wasn't at the point to where we could have done a tactile object. And so we decided that that mini matching schedule was too much for him right now. So what we did teach him was that however many bins were on that left side, he picked up the bin, he put it on the table. And for him, we did put in. So he picked up the ball out of one side and he put it into a bucket on the other side. And then he would put it in the finished basket. And at that time, his finished basket was a ginormous box because his tasks were very large. It could look like this. So this is what I would call independent workstation. The thing is that some of the other rules that you always have to think about is we always work from left to right. So the student is picking up the work on the left, doing it in the middle, like, at the table, they're going to complete the work at the table, and then they're finishing it on the right. That's because in America, we read from left to right. If we were doing this in, say, Japan, we would work, I believe, top to bottom in Japan, and it's based on your reading, right? It's based on how you read. So it's country specific. So in America, we work from left to the right. We pick up our work on the left, we finish in the middle, and then we move to the right. So that's one example of what it might look like. These are finished baskets. So you can see, and these are also other workstations. It could just be simply a table. This example at the bottom of the screen is just a table. Their basket, they're picking their work. They're picking their work from the left to the right. So in this one, there's another table or a little shelf you can't see, and they're pulling the work to the middle, and their finished basket is just this line of tape, and that little pink sign at the bottom there says finished. Finished is another concept that's really hard for students sometimes. Where do things go when they're finished? What does finished mean? And so we're teaching them that finished. And the nice thing is for me, when they learned finished in the setting of Workstation, then I had a finished basket. I had a student who always had a toy in their hand. They always needed some sort of object in their hand. And when we were leaving the classroom, that wasn't always appropriate for them to take that with them. So they had a finished basket. After they had learned it in Workstation, we used it in other settings. We used not the same finished basket from their Workstation, but a different one that was for finishing other items in the classroom. You can see the example of the folder. So we're putting the things to do on the left side, and then we're putting the things that are already done on the right side. This is really nice if you have students who are going out into the regular classroom, or maybe they're in a high school classroom and they're going to vocational classes. When students are traveling out there with other kids, this is you can essentially use a folder workstation system that travels with them. So lots of different examples of what it could look like. So this example shows they are pulling objects off this shelf. So the shelf is tall, so they're just picking, it looks like they have 3 or 4 baskets there. I would say starting out, I always have at least 2 baskets of work. My work might only take 1 or 2 seconds in each basket. It depends on how long my student can successfully tolerate working. But I have at least 2 baskets starting out because I want them to learn that I do one thing and then I do another thing. And then I get my choice, or I get my break, some sort of reward at the end. I have had students that have done up to 5 or 6 baskets that have been doing work systems for a while. And so it's one way to kind of expand that independent workstation, if you will. And I'm still talking independent workstation with that. It can look like a lot of things. The goal with independent workstation is, I usually tell teachers you want it to be somewhere, obviously, that you have minimal distractions. I have put them in the middle of my classroom, and it just depends on, I did one time build one with a piece of cardboard between 2 desks and put an independent workstation on each side on a desperate year when I had a lot of kids. So it could look like 1,000 different things. I've seen teachers make shelving out of milk crates and just stack milk crates that have been zip tied together, and use 3 milk crates. And, there's one task in each shelf of the milk crate, with a table and a desk for that student, flat against a wall somewhere, or shoved up against the back of a shelf. So you probably don't want it open facing the whole classroom. It needs to be somewhere to where the student has minimal distractions. for independent workstation. Thinking about, I did something, so this is a portable workstation. So the one, a little bit, just a better example of what we saw earlier. If you have a student, when I have used portable workstations, so if this was a student who was going from class to class, then maybe the yellow folder is reading class, maybe the orange folder is math class, and then the green folder is English. And I see somebody raise their hand. I don't know if they meant to do that or not. Did Cassidy have a
yes,
question?
I had a question.
Okay.
I kind of do the independent workstations, but I do them, I have them do them at their desk. So do you suggest that I set up just a certain area, or is it okay to let them do the independent workstations at their desk?
I think that if it's working for them and they're successful at it and it's working for you, then I wouldn't change something that's successful. Does that make sense? I usually tell people, usually when I'm in a situation that we're putting in independent workstations, it's students that are having a hard time staying at their desk, if that makes any sense at all. And so then we put it with less distractions. But if they're successful, I have had kids who have done workstations at their desk. It's just, it depends on the student. If they're successful there and they can sit at their regular desk and do a workstation there, and so it's now a portable workstation, you're bringing it to them, I think that's fine. I don't have any problem with that at all. I wouldn't change something if it's, if it's working for your students and it's successful. I would not change it as long as it's, ethical and moral. There's no issues there, and I'm not hearing any issues, right? I don't think that's a problem, but at all. But yeah, I wouldn't change something that is working for my kids. So not for that reason anyway. I will say that one of the thing that I do that's a little bit different than a lot of people who use just the independent workstation, I use that same 3-bin system to do what I call teacher workstation. And when I say teacher workstation, I mean any adult in my classroom. My classroom assistants ran a teacher workstation. So I did this at my kidney table. And then in my last classroom that I was in, we had a couple of other adult workstations set up, and my aides were running those. And so when different kids were coming in and out of those, and so we used the same 3 bins, and I put in the work in those 3 bins that they couldn't do independently yet. A lot of times it was IEP goals. We did reading, whatever it was that I was trying to teach those students. The other thing that I did in teacher workstation was I taught alternate assessment. I taught alternate assessment through those teacher workstation, because now I have taught them I have taught them a system of how to learn things and to hopefully not be so upset. A lot of my students, when they were asked to come and sit down at the table and work with me, would get upset because they didn't know when the work was going to go away, right? They didn't know how much work they had to do. All of those 4 questions in the beginning. But for my kids, once I answered those questions, how much work, how long am I going to have to work? What do I do next when I'm done? Well, I found out that was a great routine now that I've taught them. And when it was time to teach them alternate assessment, and also for me, I did not do most of my kids could not do, I had friends who had students who took the alternate assessment test up on their whiteboard, and they would mark choices on the whiteboard. But for me, I found for my students, it was better if I put one task of one part of an alternate assessment, say one reading had 5 questions. Well, then I have 5 bins, and each question, there's 1 question in each bin. And that was how I did my alternate assessment with my students, was I gave them that test inside of what I called a teacher workstation. Now my aides didn't do that part, right? Because legally you have to be a certified teacher to give the alternate assessment. But when we were teaching it, and once I taught the concept and now we're just reviewing that material, that was definitely something that my classroom assistants could help me with. And so each of my students, I had a set of materials that were kept for their own teacher work system, for their own teacher workstation. And that way I could do individualized learning. Sometimes it was IEP goals, sometimes it was alternate assessment, For some of my kids, it was regular assessment. You know, they weren't on alternate assessment. They were in regular assessment. And so it was skills and academic skills that they needed for that. So I like it because there's so much flexibility. Once you have taught the system to your kids, there's so many different ways that you can utilize it. But I do really like teacher workstations. So these are just examples of things that could be put inside of a workstation. So the nice thing is you can see at the top, there is a bin with the little hand soaps and toothbrushes. In that bin, they're assembling hygiene kits. So each kit gets one of each of those items. You can see Isaac is learning to spell his name. The bin at the bottom is color matching. So it's straws that have been cut, and they are working on matching those straws to the colored items. The cool thing is that anything can go inside of a workstation. Once you're teaching them that system, then anything could potentially become a shoebox task. And these essentially are what I would call shoebox tasks. If you've ever heard of that before. Does anybody use shoebox task or use this type of learning in your classroom? If you have a great shoebox task that you use, and you don't mind, if you want to drop an example of that in the chat, or a short description, maybe you're teaching name in a shoebox task. I've had shoebox tasks for alternate assessment when years and years ago, when my students were in 3rd grade, we had to measure. So I had shoebox tasks for measuring. My ruler was glued down to the top of the box, and they pulled out different items and they had to measure that and then attach a Velcro number of how long what the measurement was to the item. And so then I just kept that same box and changed out the items and the numbers for my students. So they got a lot of opportunities to measure a lot of different things once they had some practice. For a long time, that might have been done in teacher workstation. And then as my students became more independent, then they could do that in their independent workstation. So just a big differentiation there for me was sometimes my kids were going to do that on their own in independent workstation. And then sometimes they were going to do it. Sometimes they were going to do it with me or with another adult. And Doug just dropped into the chat some other shoebox task examples. Esther says, yes, the hygienes. We talk to certain students to show us what they do, look in the mirror. So they're using shoebox tasks to get through their hygiene. And I don't know how often, but probably daily or weekly to kind of go through independent hygiene. So Jessica said that she has shoebox tasks for matching socks. That's a great one. That's a useful one if you have students who are having to do things at home. So you're on home learning or virtual learning. I've had parents who've said, teachers who've said, I told their parents to have a match socks. And I'm like, it seriously is a skill. You're color matching, you're doing all kinds of things with that. And it's useful in life. Hanging shirts, wrapping silverware, lacing and tying shoes. Ooh, putting batteries in a flashlight. That's a useful one this winter. Our power has gone out a few times. Being able to put those batteries in a flashlight. And I'm thinking they probably have older students. There's a ton of different examples of what shoe boxes could look like. So how could you use this for virtual learning? I'm trying to keep that in mind now, especially since we're living in a world to where it's a day-to-day basis. Sometimes we're in school, sometimes we're on virtual learning. Sometimes we have kids who have to go out because they have illness. And so now they're going to have to learn at home for the next few weeks. So if I have taught this in my classroom, and I will say, if this is a student who's never used workstations before, then I wouldn't start out with this on virtual learning. But I would make sure, hopefully I have a chance to teach them this inside of my classroom. And then I'm going to have a conversation with mom and dad or, guardians, whoever's going to be there to help them. Because the part about working from left to right is really a key principle, because it will be useful later when they learn how to read, or if they learn how to read, or if you're even just teaching some of the basic reading skills, learning that we go from left to right is going to be really critical for them. Some of the things that I have had teachers do this year was, well, how do we afford bins to send home? And sometimes we have work with families that are able to send things back home. And sometimes we work with families. I had a family that we worked with, well, they had 6 other kids, and sometimes the materials that you sent home got destroyed, and that's expensive, and it takes a lot to kind of put some of these tasks together. I have had a teacher this year use Coke boxes. She used her bins where she got extra paper boxes from the copier room, and so each bin was the box that the paper came in. And she took Coke boxes and cut apart and made puzzles and made matching objects. She even made sorting out of like newspaper clippings or the Kroger paper, if your area still gets the sales paper from Kroger. So that was a great resource for free color pictures. And it was something that she could send home. So she cut apart pictures of fruits, and she cut apart pictures of meat. And so kids were sorting, what is a fruit? What is meat? What is items that would go in the refrigerator? What are items that might go on a shelf? So they use the clippings from the Kroger paper or other sales paper, whatever grocery store you have in your area. And usually you can get those for free. Sometimes I've gone in and just swiped a whole handful. Or if I've worked in a big classroom, I've had my assistants, bring me in their newspaper, their sales papers when they're done. But there are some good options for virtual learning. And I will say, I'll say just a couple more things about potential benefits of this. Is it gives you a systematic approach to learning. And that's something that our kids really need. And I will tell you, when I was a teacher, and I was fully certified teacher, and I had all the classes, but when I was in a classroom with so many kids that did not know how to learn, it was very overwhelming as the adult in the classroom who was responsible. And I really didn't know where to start. And so structured learning, structured workstations gave me a starting point to build my classroom from. Now, in my classroom of 11, I started with my most difficult kids. I started with my kids who were giving me the biggest challenge. You might want to start with your kids that this is going to be the easiest to work with if you've never done this before. It's up to you. I would just say choose whichever one you think is most doable for you. It builds independence. It's going to generalize to other environments. You can send this home. You can send this all kinds of places that will go with kids. So Jessica Treadway popped into the chat and it says, oh, if you have a locally owned newspaper, they often have a lot of those sales paper left over each week, and they're happy to give them. They might be happy to give them to you. So that's a great resource. And we'll talk about some ways to resource materials for this. It will help you. It's a good way to maintain mastered skills, especially that independent workstation. If you have skills that your kids have already learned, but a lot of our students need to go back and practice, or they lose those skills that they've mastered with you. So independent workstation is a perfect place for them to go back and work on those skills that they've already mastered. The nice thing is that it can be used with a ton of different learners, all ages, all functional and ability levels. There's so much potential benefit for structured workstations that I have found it to be so helpful for so many different learners. So pitfalls to avoid are not understanding the needs of the learner. So maybe this is a student who you have to use colored pictures with, or maybe this is a student who isn't ready. You thought they were going to be able to be independent, but maybe they're not ready. Maybe this is a student who only can tolerate work for 3 seconds. I've had a few students like that over the year, or 10 seconds. So if I have a student who will only sit down and work with me for 10 seconds, then I'm going to stop at 9. In the beginning, I'm going to stop at 9 because my goal is for them to be successful. The other pitfall is I see students that only do independent work systems all day. Some of our most challenging students a lot of times get relegated to only independent workstations. They just get sent there multiple times a day, which I'm not anti. My students went in and out of independent workstations 4 or 5 times a day. every time there was different work in there, right? And we'll talk about that. How do we get a ton of material? The other pitfall is we will get 4 or 5 shoebox tasks and kids will do them every day for a year. So you need to have a big variety. The goal is over time to have a big variety. After I had been doing this for about a year, I had probably over 100 tasks. And every year I added some stuff. I kept trying to add things. So the other pitfall can be too much distractions. If you have a student who is having a really hard time completing their work, then it could be there's too many distractions inside or around their workstation. It could be an issue for them. Other things to think about is our students sometimes will memorize the answers. So being able to change things up, making sure that they're not getting that same workbox every day for a year or a month. Some kids might need the same workbox every day for a month. It might be appropriate, but a lot of kids don't. They're going to need a big variety of stuff. And that takes time to build. That does take time to build, and that's okay. Students are not interested. So not using student interest. So the other cool thing about shoebox task, or it could be file folders, it could be a file folder task, is not using student interest. So I had a student who she really liked to look at travel brochures, and the school that I was in I didn't have access to color ink. That was a big challenge for me. I did not have access to color ink. And so making shoebox task or getting access to make file folder tasks was really hard. Well, my student really liked looking at travel brochures, we found out. And so what I did was the next time I went on a trip, I stopped at every rest stop that had those, the free brochures. There's one on the way to Tennessee that there's a whole room filled with colorful brochures. The next time you go, get 4 or 5 of every one that you can fit in your bag. The people will think you're crazy, but I made matching. So if I got 2 of the same brochure, then I cut those pieces apart, and now it became a file folder matching game. I made sorting. Here are people, here are animals. This is, we sorted trees versus animals, like all kinds of, you could do a sorting task, you could do matching task out of those glossy travel brochures. And I just cut them apart and of course, laminated everything and Velcroed things down, and made all kinds of file folder tasks that went into my students' independent learning, their independent workstations. So thinking outside of the box, some of the other things that are really hard sometimes can be really hard to come up with the shoe boxes themselves. There is a company called, if you look up TEACCH Shoebox, it is a group out of North Carolina. So it's a group out of North Carolina, and they actually make shoebox tasks, and it is adults with autism and other developmental disabilities. And they have a whole workshop set up using structured learning stations, and they make those shoebox tasks. So the downfall is they are a little bit pricey, but it does give you a set. So it starts you out, I think a set is 16 or 18. And I'm not 100% sure how much they are. It's a couple $100 at least. So I think a set of 30 might be $400 and something. If that's not doable, and for me, it wasn't doable in the beginning, I could not afford to do that. I was able to get my director of special ed to give me, I asked for $100 or $50 to go down to the dollar store. And I went down to the Dollar Tree and bought all kinds of, stickers. And I thought about a lot of my students at that point, they could put in their skills where they could put things in. So I could put a pencil into a basket. I could put in, drop coins in a bucket, things like that. So that's what I mean when I say put in. My students could match pictures if they were color. So I bought stickers. And, if I had 2 stickers, then I could put those stickers on a little piece of an index card and make that into a matching folder, essentially. And the other nice thing is there's a ton of resources, and that's what I'm going to share with you right now. So I will tell you about this. If this is pretty short and sweet, but I have done a couple of webinars, and that's what these two links are: access to webinars that I have done. They're out on YouTube on the Kentucky Autism Training Center on their YouTube page. So they are out there. They're about an hour each. Other resources to have. This is another, just a quick, a ton of, I think it's an article. It's a ton of information in an article about structured teaching. So if you're trying to get started and you need to share information with your principal or your director of special ed, this is another great place that you can go to be able to share that. These are articles from the actual Teach Center. This is that place that I was talking about that this originated out of. So it's an article on resources for materials. When I first started doing this, I sent out an email to every teacher in my building and I said, hey, if you have old broken puzzles and Tupperware containers or diaper wipe containers or old shoe boxes, I need you to send them to me. And within 2 days, I think I had like 2 giant garbage bags of random stuff that I turned into shoebox task. This is Autism Classroom Resources. It is a webinar, not a webinar. It is a podcast. There we go. I think it's the podcast. So if you have time to click that on and listen to it, if today is your first time about hearing about these, it took me a few times of hearing about this topic before I was comfortable enough to go back and put it in my classroom. And the Pinterest link is, there's 1,001 Pinterest things on there. And they have all kinds of great examples of tasks that might be appropriate for your students that you could use to get started. Other things, just other resources. So the Breezy Special Ed are more examples of shoebox task or work task box. And then I love the Autism Helper. She has a really great short video and then some example ideals on Independent Workstation. So she has a ton of great resources. Just know that that is out there. And then this is my email, which will be, you can access, and you're welcome to email me if you're just getting started or if you've been doing it a long time and you have questions. And this is the feedback and evaluation sheet. And I will say I am done going through this PowerPoint, but I'm I'm very glad to answer questions or to help you problem solve.
Thank you, Ms. Kim. I appreciate your presentation. And we'll, like you said, hang on for a few minutes if someone has some questions, and we'll see if we can come up with answers to those. Thank you, folks, everyone for being here. We really appreciate it.